Hey everyone, and welcome to the 24th Digital Foundry Direct Weekly. Yes, as the name suggests, it's our weekly show where we discuss the latest tech news and share thoughts on our latest projects, and of course, field questions from our supporters, our backers on the Digital Foundry Supporter Program. And yes, we're back to the triumvirate this week. Joining me, John Linneman.
Hey Rich, as you can see, I have my 2005 era Far Cry HDR patch installed in my room again, so it's it's pretty intense.
Absolutely fantastic. And joining us from Berlin, bringing with him a t-shirt from another era, the 90s specifically, it's Alex Battaglia.
Hey, you in the shirt. You can. I'm gonna take a separate photo of this and send it to Audie after the fact, but this is actually even brighter than it looks on camera right now.
Have you tone mapped it?
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but it looks actually all right here, but it turns me into like radioactive goo when I wear it.
Well, I'm gonna shoot you in the face. Need
to have that like lined up.
Exactly.
Wow. I mean, that is quite a shirt, I have to admit. But let's move on to our very first topic. Okay, first news story of the week. And if you saw our content last week, you'll see that I bricked an Xbox Series S, and today I'm going to explain why. Essentially, I really wanted to know whether the Xbox Series SSD would work within PlayStation 5. You can see in the background there that I have a naked PlayStation 5. I have done the testing, and in actual fact, here is the tiny little SSD that you get within a Series S. Now, obviously, in an ideal world, I would have done a standalone video showing how the Xbox Series drive works on a PlayStation 5. And we're not, for one simple reason: it doesn't really work.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't
so you
work.
Brick your Series S in the name of science.
In the name of lunatic science, I think I referred to it as a senseless tragedy, a senseless technological tragedy in the actual teardown content. But at least we got a teardown out of it. But this is what actually happens, and it's quite interesting. So when the PlayStation 5 boots up, it actually looks as though we're in business, because the drive is recognized as a PCIe Express 4.0 drive, and I'm given the option to format the system and set up the drive. So you think, wow, okay, we're in business here. This is going to be quite interesting. But unfortunately, we reach the 13% mark on the format, and then basically the PlayStation 5 just completely gives up, and we get a hard reset. And thankfully, the PlayStation 5 is still working, but the drive is basically left blank.
Were you able to get the drive working on your PC at all?
To begin with, no, it wouldn't boot the drive. This is before I tried it in the PlayStation 5, by the way. When I put it in an NVMe slot, it wouldn't boot. The PC wouldn't boot. However, if I put the SSD into a USB enclosure, I do actually see the folder structure. There's several partitions there. User content, a couple of system update partitions. So I'm hoping, I did make an image of the drive, and I'm hoping that I can restore it and maybe get the Series S back in business again. With that said, though, I have actually tried two drives, and both of them do the same thing. So I can categorically confirm at this point that the Xbox Series SSD does not work in the PlayStation 5. And please, do not waste your hardware by giving this a go. It doesn't work. Tested on two drives.
Financially, it doesn't make a lot of sense to even try that. It's just pure mad science.
It was mad science, bad science. It's all gone horrendously wrong. I'm left with a bricked Series S, and yes, I don't recommend it. But that would have been some interesting content, but it's a no-go.
So if that's covered by warranty, send it in. Like,
probably not.
We tried to use this on the PS5 and it didn't work.
Yeah, like that.
But I'm just happy that we did manage to get the opportunity to tear down the Series S and actually see exactly what makes it tick. So we did actually get some hashtag content out of it that was worthwhile. But the killer content, actually seeing whether like Ratchet and Clank would have run on an Xbox SSD, no go. It's not working. So let's just tie that one up with a bow and move on.
It's really interesting because I've heard that some SSDs, like the lower spec ones, they don't even allow you to continue with the installation on the PS5. It just gives you an error, I think.
I think that might be PCIe 3.0 drives. I'm not sure.
So anything, yeah.
But essentially, don't try this at home. A Series S has died for this. No more. No more.
No more.
That's all we've really got to say about this one. So let's move on to the next topic. So, look, I don't know what to make of this one. There's been this game from a studio called Blue Box Studios. And the game is called Abandoned. And it has been the source of, how can you describe it? Various conspiracy theories, Hideo Kojima connections, which have been denied, and bizarre marketing, blurred out images. Nobody quite knows what it is. And a real-time trailer was released for PlayStation 5 last week, except it wasn't released. John, tell us more about it.
Yeah, so this whole situation is just ridiculous. These guys are either the best marketers of all time or the absolute worst. And basically, they put out this so-called real-time teaser thing, I guess it was called, and you load it up and it's just like, coming soon.
Well, let's go into a little bit more depth, John, because you load it up and it actually asks you to choose your language.
Oh, right, of course.
You choose your language and then it tells you, oh, yeah, check back soon. Nothing to see here. Move along. I guess they've been hyping this up literally for months. In theory, I really love the idea of a real-time trailer because
I like it too.
It is a trailer, right? But it is being generated in real time on the PlayStation 5 hardware. The concept, I think, is awesome. I'd like to actually see more of that. Certainly help our work. And but nothing apart from this text was being generated in real time. And there was no trailer. So, yeah, I mean, what do you make of it, Alex?
Like John was saying, I think there's just some weird thing happening behind the scenes here because there's almost no way in hell that this could be put out onto like the PlayStation service and actually exist there, like without some sort of QA mechanism from Sony's side picking up the fact that this is not working at all. Like it literally just doesn't work at all, right?
I would have agreed with you until that Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origins demo came out.
Oh,
remember
right.
that? That launched, it appeared, you downloaded it, and it just didn't work. And I mean, that's a little different, but still, because
the point is it was fixed, right?
But it took a few days to fix.
Okay.
So,
but they could easily pull it. Sony could easily remove it from the store.
I guess that's the thing, though, is that came from Koei Tecmo and Square Enix, I guess. So a very large company, and this whole situation with Abandon, that if this is really just a small indie teaser project, like it seems to be, it's very odd that they would basically have the leeway to be able to put out something like this on the PlayStation Store that basically doesn't work. Like I don't understand how that could get through the checks and balances of a console manufacturer in that way, and it's not something we've really seen before.
There's further sort of interest added by the fact that Shuei Yoshida basically tweeted.
Is he trolling people?
That's a kind of curious comment.
Oh my goodness.
And then Abandoned, which basically, no real comment. And, you kind of think, well, surely if he's highlighting this in any way, there must be some level of Sony involvement in this.
Shu did not tweet out Life of Black Tiger. I'm just saying. But it's I guess the way I look at this here, no matter what it is, like if this actually turned out to be something interesting and good, and the jury is very much out on whether that's even possible at this point, then you know what? I actually do enjoy marketing stuff that kind of messes with people. Like I actually wish we had more of that. But obviously people get very upset about that these days. But the Metal Gear Solid 2 thing with Raiden back in the day, I love that. That was a fantastic thing. And I almost love what they did with the Arbiter in Halo 2, except for the fact that it was spoiled by an early leak. But I liked that too. But ever since the negative reaction to that kind of stuff, it kind of feels like developers and publishers, probably rightfully so, are afraid of doing that because it does tend to rub people the wrong way.
The thing that kind of sort of fascinates me about this is that this whole sort of series of conspiracy theories that have sprung up around it. The Kojima collection, the kind of blurred out artwork. There was some on a somewhat more mundane level. There was a trees controversy surrounding it, and but fundamentally, I am a big believer in Occam's razor, which is that the most plausible and mundane explanation is usually the correct one. So it likely is just, a one-man studio. But on the other hand, this trailer release this week, the fact that this somehow made its way through Sony QA, it does kind of suggest that something bigger is happening. I mean, is Kojima involved? Where probably not, but where do we go from there? Where do we go from there? I mean, let's just layer on the conspiracy theories here. What's going on? Is there, is Elvis involved? Is there a grassy knoll?
It's at the end of the demo.
It could be Kojima and the Illuminati joining forces with this guy to troll us. I do think there is trolling here. I think that's but at this point, it seems almost inevitable.
Here's the thing, though, is if this just turns out to be a small little indie project that's managing to pull this off, there's a good chance that this could really hurt them. Like they say, any attention is good attention, but I genuinely think that if this just comes out and it's just kind of a middle of the road indie horror title or something, and I'm not saying it is or is not that, it's not going to go well for them, I don't think.
I definitely think the way this has been advertised, I don't want to criticize this group of people too much, but as soon as you realize that, people are conflating your game with some sort of levels of conspiracy theories, and I really don't think this has anything to do with Hideo Kojima or anything. I think it's just kind of a big troll that's going on right now. I think you should distance yourself from it and then keep distancing yourself from it, and not like the image release that looks kind of like, what is it? Looks like Big Boss or Naked Snake or whatever in the background blurred out. Like, why are you releasing that image? Like, what are you doing?
Let's think about that. Like, if it was really Kojima involved, would they be using any sort of like Metal Gear references in there that could potentially like be traced, like Konami property that he doesn't own? Like, it's it gets a little bit dicey.
Yeah,
I'm just looking forward to the next marketing beat on this. I mean, maybe there's going to be like a blurred image of Alfred Chicken in the background.
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah. I'm just fascinated by this now. It's like a sort of slow motion car crash. But the bottom line is that if this is an orchestrated campaign, there has to be a payoff. And the real time trailer was supposed to be it. For whatever reason, it did not materialize. I mean, I'm just trying to think of the logistics of how you can make that code not produce something. I mean, we talked about the Final Fantasy demo issues. I mean, it did actually boot and do something, right, John?
No.
The
Final Fantasy VII, when it was broken, it would just show like the splash screen, and then it would give some kind of error, and it wouldn't actually boot the game. So the game just wouldn't start.
What it didn't do was say, "Hey, check back soon."
That's right.
The demo will start working.
It didn't do that.
Yeah, that implies that they knew that at some point that it wasn't going to work, and they released it anyway, or something. It is such a weird thing that happened there.
Yeah, why would you put out the app first and then just patch it instead of just waiting to the time when you want to reveal it to people? I don't know. It's very weird. But either way, they got us. Here we are talking about it.
Well, I think that is primarily the objective of the exercise. But look, I have breaking news here. The application has been updated. 5 gigabytes worth of new content to download, and I'm going to be showing it right now. So look, once again, we choose the language, and then we get this interesting menu of teaser material that Blue Box is going to be sharing with us. And only the first thing is selectable, so let's take a look at it. I can't believe this. It really is sort of quite ridiculous. I think we're being trolled here. So look, let's just move on and carry on with our lives, right? The Radeon RX 6600 XT. It is the latest in AMD's RDNA 2 rollout. The specs, I mean, it kind of looks like a RDNA 2 version of the RDNA 1 RX 5700 XT. Issues with this, though, in that the benchmarks are kind of all over the place. The value proposition is kind of all out of whack. We're looking at a $380 card. Just to give you some insight, the 5700 XT was a $399 card a couple of years back. There's this kind of perception at the moment that not only is this the wrong product, but it's also indicative of a kind of malaise in the mainstream GPU market where there isn't value anymore. I think one particular the YouTube thumbnails kind of speak for themselves, but the one that sort of made an impact with me was the Linus Tech Tips one, which was basically $380 for a 1080p card. You know, on the face of it, it does sound ridiculous. Alex?
Yeah, I think that even though I don't like thumbnails and really provocative text, usually I think the idea of a 379?
It's 379, 380.
$380 US card for 1080p does seem rather absurd, because you look at the historical kind of GPUs that targeted the mainstream resolution of the time, which is like full HD, and you go back in time, like your 960s, none of them were in this price range at all. Like RX 480 also was not at all anywhere near this price range, right?
Yeah, it was a $250 card if memory serves.
Yeah, so that's
what I will say,
problem.
though, is that there has been a gradual shift away from value. If you look at GTX 1060 was a $299 card. And, it wasn't that much more powerful than a GTX 970. So there's kind of issues there which are kind of long-standing. And let's just look at some benchmarks here. Will sent me a kind of cheat sheet of everything that you need to know. And basically, it is faster than the RTX 3060, which is essentially on par with an RTX 2070. But the variances at 1080p are all over the place. I mean, for example, Doom Eternal 3% faster, Control 3% faster. This is 6600 XT versus 3060. But then you have the AMD friendly games, Death Stranding 20% faster, Borderlands 3 29% faster. You get the same sort of pattern at 1440p. But the weird thing is that at 4K, the performance just totally collapses. And actually, Doom Eternal on Ult for Nightmare settings, which we actually don't recommend for gameplay, that collapses at lower resolutions. So there seems to be stuff going on here with a smaller than recommended infinity cache, right, Alex?
It's kind of a unique situation that we haven't seen in a long time, where usually you expect a card or a GPU to scale in a semi-linear fashion with pixels as you go up in resolution, and you can say like, okay, it'll do this, until you usually hit a VRAM wall. That's like the only aspect where you can see a card really fall flat on its face. But this time, it's not even the fact that it's running out of VRAM necessarily. It's running out of cache, which is the primary mechanism which I thought was smart. The way AMD got more a smarter utilization of its memory interface by utilizing this infinity cache, and it's having this problem where it runs out of infinity cache and then falls flat on its face. And I think this is not great, because it kind of locks the consumer then into a GPU which is only good at like one certain thing. It's like a card that is 1080p and 1080p only, and it's a card that's 1080p and 1080p only at this price. With the other GPUs in a similar price bracket, you have a greater level of utility. Even its past historical GPUs, I want to say almost the RX, even though I didn't like the GPU that much, the RX 5700 XT did not have this issue. So I don't know. I think this card represents a number of things that I'm not happy with in the GPU market. The first one is that its initial MSRP is way too high for, I think, what its performance offers in comparison to previous generation GPUs. This is something that's been around since, I mean, people talked about a lot during the Turing launch, but there was a lot of, let's just say Pascal scales very differently than Turing. So now as you look at it over time, actually Turing looks pretty okay. But, it's, as Rich was saying, it goes back to GTX 1060 not being such a great price performance in comparison to the GTX 970. This is something that's been going on for a while. And AMD, the GPU manufacturer, which has previously always been the one focusing on this mid to low range, not at all really being capable of competing in the high range, has abandoned the low to mid range market essentially with a GPU like this.
Well, there's an argument that NVIDIA has as well, because we know they've got silicon ready to go with the RTX 3050 Ti, which is in laptops and hasn't been deployed yet in the desktop space, and I understand there's no real plans to do so in the immediate future.
Oh my gosh!
Which means that the question is why, and I guess I think there's issues here. I mean, we are seeing value in the GPU space, right? If you can actually buy the GPUs at MSRP, which is a whole other issue, but the value wins always come at the higher end. So, essentially the 2080 Ti was like, I don't know, baseline $1,000 GPU. With the 3070 delivering effectively the same thing, that price was halved. That's a value win. 3080, I'd say, if you could have got one at $699 at launch, then that is a phenomenal price
That's
performance.
Great price, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because the generational gains there are huge, and just you're seeing performance which we didn't see before. Plus, you have all of the ray tracing and DLSS stuff on top of that. So that's where the value wins are happening. But I think the lower down you go down the stack, you still need to bundle in high cost components such as VRAM. So the 3050 Ti in laptop world is shipping with 4 gigs of RAM. It's not enough.
Unacceptable.
It's not enough even for 1080p.
That's so bad. That's so bad.
Oh my God. That's a bit of an issue. But I think the bottom line is that the actual sort of sub $300. I mean, we can say that the $300 price point for a 1080p graphics card, we don't like it, but the market does, because the 1060 was the biggest seller.
We keep talking about 1080p graphics cards, and I feel like, though, most people that are most gaming PCs that are still gaming at 1080p tend to target higher refresh rates in general. And looking at the benchmarks here, this doesn't seem that capable of delivering, say, a smooth 120 hertz in most games. Or whatever.
Modern ones.
You know what I mean?
At least.
This is the problem.
It's a 1080p 60 card, which seems really uninteresting somehow, but I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a subset out there, but I mean, what do you guys think about the current state of 1080p gaming? Because when you say 1080p gaming, it could either be 1080p high refresh or just like a 1080p 60. And those are very different things.
I don't see this as a 1080p card. I don't see the 3060 as a 1080p card, because, if we class them with RTX 2070, which is where the performance spectrum is well within that spectrum, it's actually higher. Those cards are great for 1440p. And you add on DLSS to that for the 3060, and it's an awesome 1440p card. So I actually think, I don't know, I wouldn't call it being gaslit by NVIDIA and AMD, but they're kind of positioning these products as being for 1080p, but I don't think they're actually putting out silicon which addresses the 1080p market effectively.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying here. It doesn't, it's weird.
It is bizarre. And I think it is possibly a price issue, because it's not just the cost of the silicon. It's, the memory seems to be a massively important component, and it is expensive. And it's got to ship. I mean, it's got to ship. The very barest minimum is 6 gigs, and I don't think that's enough these days. It's got to be 8 minimum, really. Yeah. So, I mean, if we talk about prospective RTX 3050 Ti, then it's got to be 2060 performance, but with 8 gigs of RAM. And
cheap.
Yeah, and cheap. $250
Max.
lower than that. Yeah, max, exactly, yeah.
That's exactly what I would really like. 2060 performance, which I think is fine enough for 1080p gaming. It is really good. It also has enough ray tracing juice in there with DLSS especially to do something. But the 2060 always fell on its face, especially in most recent titles, due to the amount of VRAM it had. So they cannot at all try and push a 4 gigabyte GPU to the market. And it has to be below 300 USD, especially since the 3060 is MSRP 300, right? 330? 330?
330, yeah. So 330. It's basically, what, 10% up from the 1060. So, this really is kind of bizarre because the 3060 doesn't make sense pricing-wise up against the 3060 Ti, which is basically, I think, probably the price versus performance sweet spot for Ampere, if you could actually buy one at MSRP, of course.
Yeah, that's true.
The 3060 was kind of bizarre in that it didn't make sense compared to the higher end cards. But if you looked at it gen on gen up against 1060, 2060, then yes, it does make a lot more sense. But that kind of just highlights the kind of concertina effects that we're having, where the value is being brought only if you give NVIDIA and AMD more money. If you see what I mean. That's the way that it's working.
Yeah, it's
this whole situation is ridiculous at this point. The cost of GPUs, the availability, it's very, very difficult right now.
I think things are easing up, and there was a kind of drop of 3060s and 3060 Ti's, coincidentally enough, when the new AMD card dropped.
Do we have any info or insight on the availability of the 6600 XT though? I mean, 379 feels overpriced, but how available is this thing going to be?
I don't know. I think it did actually linger on some of the e-tailers for a few hours when it launched. Based on I looked at some tweets this morning. So, but I noticed that Hardware Unboxed and Gamers Nexus put out basically the same poll, which is if you could buy one of these things at MSRP, would you? And the answer basically was no. And that's kind of interesting because it sort of highlights that the reviews can still make an impact on how a product is going to land, even in a world where you can't buy any other GPU. So, yeah, that is kind of bizarre. But I don't know where we go from here. I think we need a $250 card. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, big time.
I want to see that, and I also want to see for example, 2 years after almost 2 years, maybe a year and a couple months after each console generation launched in the past, there's always been a GPU that comes out which has great price performance and absolutely wrecks the consoles, usually with 2x more in the games when you equivalate settings. You have, your 8800 GT. You have your GTX 970, which, by the way, was incredible for many people. You have that kind of thing happening. If we don't have that in a couple, I would say the next 6 to 8 months, 8 months, maybe a little bit longer after that, then I'd say the GPU market has really, it's in a place that I actually really, really dislike, because you should be able to get affordable console-like performance at least a year to, 16 months after the things come out.
Well, this is an interesting question from Ben Fisher, Alex, which I took out from the Patreon Q&A, which is, what are our thoughts on pricing and relative value of these mid-range cards when compared to the consoles? And this is interesting, right? Because you can get let's say Series X PS5, $500, PS5 digital, $400, and then that's basically the cost of a 3060 Ti on its own. And then you've got these cards, which are 6600 XT, 379, 3060, 329. I mean, we're talking about MSRPs as if they're actually a real thing here, but that is the pitch, right? So what do you reckon? I mean, I'll tell you my thoughts on the 3060 is that essentially, if you're running a multi-platform game that uses ray tracing, then the uplift that you get from extra performance from RT offsets the reduction in rasterization performance. So what I'm finding is that 3060 class hardware can actually deliver a console-like experience. You can do reconstruction to 4K. DLSS is, a game changer. The thing that I find really interesting about DLSS is that because you are starting from a 1080p base resolution, then effectively it's equaling what the consoles are doing with dynamic 4K and arguably doing it better with DLSS performance mode.
Yeah, getting better IQ usually. Yeah.
Yeah. But what about that specific question? Pricing and relative value, Alex.
I think on the NVIDIA side, it's okay-ish. I've said it before, though, that I think those GPUs still need to be cheaper because especially if you look at like what you're getting gen on gen from a GPU that came out,
and available, by the way.
And available. You're not getting it at MSRP. So I don't actually think the PC market is in a place right now where you look at what you're getting next to the consoles at MSRP and you're getting good value. I don't think you are until you start getting up into the upper high end range. Like Rich mentioned earlier, on the NVIDIA side specifically. The one thing that I haven't actually really, if you were to play a game, for example, on the AMD side, on the other hand, you're not going to get actually great performance vis-a-vis the consoles in games that have ray tracing, which I find really disappointing. If I were to buy a card, because you're getting a new GPU and you want to play the latest titles, and the latest titles that are coming out are going to be multi-platform, and they're going to start sooner or later mandating ray tracing performance. And if you're getting console experiences just because of the driver stack or because the settings in a PC version of a game don't go low enough for the AMD cards, like regarding ray tracing or something like that. Because we've had it before where on console, the ray tracing setting is actually below what you can get on PC. And that's something that should always actually be there in a game because, you're going to have AMD cards that are going to want to run the game as well too. So I actually think on the AMD side, it's not very good. On NVIDIA side, it's a bit better thanks to better ray tracing performance and things like DLSS, but still, price-wise, to respond to this question, I think it's still in a terrible place.
Well, Will actually ran our control benchmark, the Corridor of Doom, at console settings, and it just about hit 30 frames per second, but it looks like there were some pretty difficult issues on the lower 1% and whatnot. So yeah, that kind of highlights the issues there. I guess the other thing, of course, though, is that the ray tracing is of a higher precision than the console version. But regardless, we were looking at the 6600 XT as a kind of RDNA 2 equivalent to the 5700 XT, which is very similar in our tests to PlayStation 5 rasterization performance, but the comparison's just gone out of the window with these Infinity Cache issues.
Yeah, man. I don't know.
Effectively, it's double the bandwidth on the 5700 XT. And there's some. I'd recommend going to the Eurogamer review that we'll put together to take a look at some of those benchmarks because there is clearly stagnation in pricing in this kind of class of card because, as I said, it is comparable to RX 5700 XT. And it's only $20 cheaper MSRP compared to the product that came out a couple of years ago.
Why do they even need to be competitive at this point? That's kind of the concern, right? Because they can't make enough cards to keep them in stock. So there's very little incentive to actually be super competitive with the pricing.
Very little.
Yeah, that's the other thing, of course, which is, we saw it to a certain extent with 3070 Ti and 3080 Ti where, they can put what look like bad prices on these products because fundamentally they're going to be sold anyway. And it really does look like the same situation here with the 6600 XT. And it's kind of not gone down well. I think our review was actually probably one of the more balanced based on what I saw. But it is just kind of baffling how performance just totally tanks at 4K. I'll say baffling. It's because of the Infinity Cache.
Yeah, it's obvious why. It's just
Okay, well, let's move on. So next topic point here: Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Its existence apparently has been leaked. John,
saw a story from Fanbyte recently, and it does seem like there was sort of a reveal that this kind of exists based on a video chat with one of the voice actresses that had worked on the series. But so there's not that much known officially, of course, but I think it's pretty obvious that something like this would be in development at this point. The series has been very successful, especially the last couple releases. I'm just very curious to see what this would look like and whether or not it's still targeting, like, say, the current generation of Switch, or if it's targeting something a little bit beyond that. I mean, this. What do you think?
So I'm just curious. So when did Xenoblade Chronicles 2 came out? I remember your review of it, John. I just can't remember the year.
So that was earlier in the life cycle of the Switch. I can't remember the exact. It was either 2017, even the first year. I can't remember, but even that game was pushing the Switch really hard to the point where you were getting like 360p resolution in handheld mode. So I'm very curious to see what else they can do with this regular hardware.
Yeah, they've always seemed to be pushing hardware going back, I guess, to what would be the Wii days, right, John?
I mean, they did a large, beautiful open world game on the Wii.
Which is what? I actually have one somehow. I found one on the street corner, by the way. So I have a Wii now. It's like the only personal console I have anymore is a Wii for some reason.
That's a news story in its own.
Alex has a Wii. Dun, dun, dun.
I'm sure there'd be some sort of Chad Warden commentary.
We'll see what we can make up for that. But I think if they're going to try, like they always do, and up the ante, make it more impressive, each title going out in terms of graphical and size of these open worlds, I kind of fail to see how they could optimize the game so much to fit on the current Switch hardware.
I mean, unless they're not pushing the technology.
Unless they're not pushing it anymore, but
I guess I'm sort of curious about timescales on this because, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, that kind of worked on the Switch, but the hardware was dragged kicking and screaming into getting a good presentation there, right? So how do you, where do you go further with a new, with a new game? I strongly suspect it will be Super Switch, Switch Model S, whatever. But let's see what happens there because, I think the sort of situation with Switch at the moment is that it does seem to be sort of losing a bit of pace, possibly. With that said, though, the sales year to date still look pretty big.
Yeah, the sales are exceptional. So I don't know. It's difficult to say, but I think it's pretty clear that the reception to the OLED model was perhaps not what Nintendo had hoped.
I'm not sure what they would have expected. I mean, they've typically underperformed on the hardware side, and it's all made up for with the quality of the gameplay experiences. But there's just,
For a game like this, though, I don't know.
Well, we're reaching the point where the hardware limitations of the Switch are becoming apparent, especially, I mean, we say it all the time, especially when it's used in dogs. And it seems to be just becoming more and more of an issue. So, well, I don't know. I guess we'll leave that one there. Let's move on. Anton Kaplanyan, who worked on NVIDIA RTX and DLSS as a research scientist at NVIDIA, has joined Intel as the Vice President of Graphics Research. He also worked at Crytek. So, he's joined Intel. What do you reckon's going on there, Alex?
Anton's field of work goes back really far back and started off kind of primarily at Crytek back in the day, working on CryEngine 2, CryEngine 3 upgrade stuff and moving the engine over to be real-time lighting all the time, including
so many brilliant engineers started there.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
From like I would say 2003 to like 2014, 15, Crytek's just had produced some of the most amazing people in the industry. Worked on light propagation volumes, which then found its way into a number of titles, and we still see it today, which is a real-time GI solution for those who don't know. And Anton's work essentially since then was focusing on getting on the real-time ray tracing and hardware up to snuff on NVIDIA side on Turing, as well as the initial opening bits of DLSS. So I think it's around the 1x to early 2x time period, so DLSS 2. And then I'm pretty sure moved on to Facebook, where they also worked on neural image synthesis. And since then, I mean, moving off from there now, it's moving on to Intel. And I imagine, based upon the profile of Anton and everything that he's doing and the position he's taking up at Intel about essentially deciding the software and hardware intermeshing and what the direction this will go in the future, that just shows really, really well that Intel is going to be pushing for hard on ray tracing and hard on ML. Because otherwise this person's profile is just, what's the point? They're not going to be just sitting there doing compute rasterization stuff all the time. I think this is awesome because this means in time, we'll have to wait till we get a greater sense of what the new Xe architecture is for dedicated GPUs. The most recent one that should be coming out, I think, was it Q1, 2022, right, Rich? I think that's the Xe. I think that's the target.
That's the big sort of unknown almost in the industry at the moment, which is, what's happening with Intel's discrete GPUs. They've put out a really weedy one, the DG1. I think it was available in ASUS OEM machines. It's been benchmarked. It's sort of 1050 Ti performance. But beyond that, there's not been that much revealed publicly. I expect that to change imminently. But yeah, it's fundamentally hugely exciting for the PC space because we've got a third contender.
We really need this.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it's significant in a number of ways, which is, first of all, NVIDIA needs competition who have got the ability to actually get cards out there in volume. They need a competitor who can challenge them in terms of investment in research and development. And, it's pretty clear that AMD are a smaller company who kind of move in phases, right? So if you look at what they did with Zen, it started off looking okay, and then it became better and better, and now they've got a class-leading product. But that doesn't happen with the first-gen sort of product. It happens in iterations over years, right? You can't get a class-leading product out day one. And then we're starting to see the same thing happening with the GPU side, where RDNA 2 is such a colossal leap over, Vega, even RDNA 1. But it is still very much an early phase product, hence the ray tracing performance not being quite up to snuff, hence the lack of machine learning acceleration with dedicated silicon. So all of this stuff, I suspect, will come in time with AMD. But then at the same time, we've now got this third contender, and we don't know anything about them. We know that they've basically got Xe, which it looks like it's scaling up from their existing technologies. But we don't quite know where the ray tracing is going to land, nor the machine learning. But we do know, and certainly with appointments like this, that they're going to invest heavily in it. And this is the kind of competition we need. And maybe, just maybe, there has been rumors, talk of Intel Xe SS, which is DLSS from Intel. And, we need that kind of competition there. If it's an open alternative, all the better.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's historical basis in the fact that something that Intel would produce on the software side that is integrated into games would actually be one that runs on every single GPU out there. They don't tend to hardware lock things in. So that would be pretty awesome to see. And that's what I'm expecting. Something that competes with NVIDIA on a different level than the way AMD competes, by targeting, I would say, different feature sets.
This is the first time that we might ever see this, though, which is interesting as well. Intel has traditionally not succeeded in the graphics card space. So
no.
Yeah,
to say the least.
Interesting, right?
It's an amazing story.
To see how that lands. And I think I'm personally not too worried about the silicon as such. What I am worried about is the software side of things. Famously, NVIDIA has more software engineers than hardware engineers. And you can see that paying off with stuff like DLSS. And, the closer integrations that they have with developers in getting maximum performance out of RTX cards, that is like it's something that which we don't actually know that much about. We only know about it from, talk with developers. There's occasional hints where, we had guys from Intel turn up to help us optimize the game. But that kind of understates the sheer size of the operation there. So that's kind of the challenge that I think that Intel have got to face head on. It's to kind of get that software solution in place as well as the hardware. But, I can't wait to see more there. And, if they can actually integrate all of these technologies, GPU and CPU, surely that's the end game, right? Because the the volumes are mostly in laptop chips, for example.
It would be interesting to see, for example, in the integration of those things, because they're now going to be focusing more on heterogeneous architectures as a result of these GPUs, I think. They tried to focus on it a couple of years ago with, I forget the name of it, they call it like, when you could do like video exports, they call it some very specific thing.
Oh, that thing.
What is that called? I forget what it's called.
It's using QuickSync.
QuickSync, yes. They tried to push this heterogeneous approach years ago. It kind of fell off, and they haven't talked about it since then. But I think this will be another push for that. And what I would really love to see, maybe let's just say like 3 or 4 years down the line, is Intel APUs that focus on mid-range gaming performance. The equivalent, of like a really affordable, good GPU on top of a CPU package. I would really like to see that.
Well, it's kind of interesting, really, because I've just done a teardown of the Xbox Series S. And some might say that is actually a really good integration of CPU and GPU in a tight power budget with a tiny form factor. I mean, that would be, as I say in the teardown video, an amazing laptop solution if they could actually get that out there. Dual boot PC and Xbox, I'd love to see that. Anyway, Intel, we shall see more soon, I suspect, and I can't wait to see what they got. Okay, so let's round off with the last news topic of the week, which is kind of interesting. The makers of the C64, which is kind of like a smaller retro-sized Commodore 64 emulator, they're doing an Amiga version, the A500 Mini.
Yeah, so this was just announced this week, and it looks great. So I do appreciate these little small form factor computers and consoles, of course. It does feel like we're kind of past the mini console wave, I suppose, but the Amiga, I think, is actually a really interesting one because it is a platform. It was very popular, but it's a little bit more, the barrier to entry is a little bit higher still, I think, in terms of, there's some good emulation options, but actually getting an original Amiga, it's slightly more difficult, I think, for people. So this is kind of a good chance to have an all-in-one package where they can easily revisit a bunch of classic Amiga games on there and do some other stuff with it as well. So and they went for an A500 style design in a mini form, but it does support up to AGA stuff, of course. But what I really love is, so it has both the Amiga mouse in all its blocky glory, and they also have included sort of a design replica of the CD32 style pad. The Amiga CD32 being a short-lived consoleized version of the Amiga that runs from a CD that was released back in the 90s. And it's a fascinating design, to say the least, but I think it's really cool to see it. So I think this is something we'll probably look at down the line. At least we'll do a stream or something. I know Audie's like super interested in this, being that he grew up with Amiga stuff. I have a real Amiga now, but it's an A600, but modded, of course, so it's much faster than a stock. The only thing that I'm wondering about, and this is going to be the trick, and I suppose they probably don't have a good solution for this either. Pretty much all software worthwhile on the Amiga runs at 50 hertz rather than 60 hertz. Obviously, I'm fairly confident this is going to be a 60 hertz output device. So that means most of the games will probably be running at 50 hertz internally, so you have that frame rate conversion happening. So we'll have to see how that looks. It's a little up in the air. I'm not usually a fan of that kind of thing, but I don't really think there's a better solution right now.
Don't most modern televisions, though, support a 50 hertz input?
They do, and I think it would be cool if that was like an optional thing, because not all do support that, but I think most do. So as some sort of an optional, like, hey, do you want to run in 1080p 50 output or something, would be a great solution to that.
They got a bunch of games announced: Alien Breed 3D, Another World, ATR All-Terrain Racing, Battle Chess, Cadaver, Kickoff 2, Pinball Dreams, Simon the Sorcerer, Speedball 2 Deluxe, Brutal Deluxe rather, The Chaos Engine, Worms, The Director's Cut, Zool, Ninja of the Nth Dimension. What other games would you like to see?
Mr. Nuts.
Mr. Nuts.
I'm not joking.
Think of, that springs to mind is Paradroid 90. But to be honest, I never played that, which is kind of bizarre because a friend of mine worked on it, and it was actually developed in my hometown. So yeah, I'd quite like to see that. Here's the thing, though. I kind of, as soon as I got a job in the games industry, my interest in the Amiga kind of flagged, simply because I was being exposed to all of the new consoles. So I'm kind of interested in checking this out, simply just to see what happened next, almost.
Man, I'd also love to see Lionheart on there. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but if you have not played Lionheart, go check it out. The visuals are quite mind-blowing for the platform. So pixel art courtesy of Hank Nieborg.
Stardust was on there as well, right?
Yeah, Stardust was on there, correct? Yeah.
So in terms of power, though, this version of the Amiga, what is it? You said it's based on the 500?
The visual design is based on the Amiga 500. I would say by and large, and just in terms of what you look at in terms of raw performance from it, you typically don't have games quite matching like Super NES or Sega Mega Drive or anything like that. But there are some exceptions, and there's some very impressive games on here. And it's just, there was so much stuff written for the Amiga, and it's a neat platform. And of course, you know, I feel like one of the coolest, I don't think it's confirmed or anything, but it would be cool if they included like Deluxe Paint or something on there. Just allow people to make some stuff with D-Paint once again. That would be fun.
There are some interesting games. I mean, Midwinter was an interesting game back in the day. That was on the Amiga. I remember having the presentation from the developer on that when I was at Computer and Video Games. There's a bunch of stuff. Hunter from Graph Gold, that was a really interesting 3D game. They were a lot more experimental with 3D on the Amiga compared to the consoles. So yeah, I'm going to be interested to see how this one all sort of pans out. But let's move on. Okay, so we're going to move on quickly to some Digital Foundry content discussion. I'm going to head off with this one. It is Control on Series X, which is kind of curious because I revisited this one recently for a project I'm working on. And we had some issues with this one when it launched, in that there was bizarre glitching all over the place on Series X. But on my playthrough, I actually found it to be super smooth at 60 frames per second. There's barely any drops there. It actually seems to have improved. And yet, I don't know, Alex, what you make of this. It doesn't look like the game's been updated in like months. So bizarre, right?
I mean, we've heard behind the scenes that at the beginning, especially the console launch, we talked about it back then, and there was, you know, obviously there's controversy about talking about it, but the fact that the Series X launched in a development state with its developer SDK and the tools using it, or even the drivers and the internal spec, was not actually completely finished almost on a certain level. So actually, just by the game development, the Xbox Series X getting updated over time, could actually see moments where we see games getting performance boosts, because the issue wasn't necessarily the game software itself, but something in the Xbox software development stack. So I wouldn't be surprised completely. I mean, I've heard from other developers that they've seen through Xbox updates that they've seen greater performance, like on the ray tracing side, or a greater the ability to program like an LDS or something like that, like it was Scratch. They've had these things that have been updated over time. So it would be pretty interesting if this is actually a case of that with Control.
Now, what I want to know is, have we seen this before? The idea where the console OS or something on the software side was impacting performance in a way that a game is fixed by a further update to the OS level rather than the game itself. I feel like this is kind of new territory for consoles.
What about the Black Crush stuff on Xbox One?
Yeah, it's a visual thing. Yeah.
I guess it's similar, but yeah, I guess you could say that. Although that was less of a bug and more of like an intentional thing, I think, originally.
But it's still the concepts that at the system level something is changing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So did that actually work on older games? Were older games improved there? Because here's the thing: I was always of the belief that the titles were virtualized, and it was kind of like set in amber at that point. There's not much that could be done, But if the system can be improved, and it kind of strikes out of that sort of virtualized box, then possibly that would explain what I'm seeing with Control on Series X. I don't know.
At the same time, I mean, it's unlikely, but it also opens up the door for possibilities of breaking a game inadvertently. Like, I would hope not, but it's really like new territory, right? Or we're really seeing like potential performance impacts just from updating the OS level.
I'm assuming that they would avoid that by making a developer stay within spec always with within DirectX spec and things like that. Maybe this is, I really don't think that would happen ever, but it would be really funny if it did.
So, John, let's talk about black frame insertion, because a lot of people are very interested in your observations here and how you're actually improving the gameplay experience with specific settings on your OLED display. And I think we need to sort of get some new information out there, right?
I've talked about this many times. The idea is essentially to reduce motion blur or eliminate motion blur on flat panel displays by essentially pulsing the display. It's been called things like ultra low motion blur. It's called black frame insertion. There's many names for it, but the idea is you're essentially like blanking out the screen between frames, and that sort of gets rid of the persistence blur kind of inherent when using a sample and hold style display. The thing is, you know, with LCD panels, at really high refresh rates in that, you can kind of like overcome it, but the pixel response is still a little bit slower, I've found, compared to OLED. OLED pixels are very responsive. So when you use black frame insertion there, the motion quality you get is superb. So specifically in the case of the LG series, so I'm using the CX OLED still, I use this feature a lot. And the primary reason I would use it is with side-scrolling games, 60 frames per second games that aren't heavy on motion blur, or 120 frames per second games that fall into the same category. But I wouldn't use it for 30 because you actually benefit a little bit from persistence blur for blending the frames together. And I always use the LG Motion Pro option set to high, it should be noted. Obviously, the drawback, though, when you blank out the screen is that it reduces overall brightness. So I was like, okay, I love this feature. How can I improve the brightness? Because if you're in 120 hertz mode, already brightness is improved because the pulses, I guess, it's reduced in terms of the duration. The screen is black. There's more frames. So that already helps. Add HDR on top of that. That further boosts the overall luminance of the display. At 60 hertz with HDR, it's pretty reasonable, but I always found that 60 hertz in SDR was pretty dim with this mode. So I discovered a couple things. First of all, I started on this path trying to say, well, what if I can inject HDR into it? And actually, the thing that actually triggered this was Mike Chi updated the RetroTink 5X Pro with some new CRT filters, which are phenomenal at simulating like the phosphor level of a screen in a relatively convincing way. It looks great, but obviously it dims the screen further. So when you combine that with black frame insertion, it's quite dim. So I'm like, all right, what can I do? First of all, I have this thing. Richard would know it. It's the HD Fury linker, right? This little device, you can do a lot of, it's kind of a programmable device. You can insert metadata into there and sort of like change the output. So basically you input a console into this thing, you get something else out of it, and this thing can do processing on board. And the idea was I can inject HDR, basically put the SDR into an HDR container to raise the brightness. And this actually does help. It's a little fiddly though, but it does work. But somebody else on Twitter, actually, it's at Joseph St. Paul. He raised my attention to something I did not know of before, which is an application called Color Control from Mawsoft. And this seems to have been primarily for changing NVIDIA driver settings or display settings more quickly than the actual control panel, which is really cool too, by the way. But it also supports control for LG TVs. And what this does is it allows you to access settings that are typically grayed out when using the normal mode. So like, for instance, in game mode, when using black frame insertion, or just when you're in SDR in game mode, at the bottom of one of the menus, there's a setting that says peak brightness. It's grayed out in game mode. If you enable this in some of the other modes in SDR, it basically boosts your brightness by about 150 nits, right? So you get this extra bit of brightness in SDR. This, by using color control, you're able to pair your TV using Bluetooth to your PC. The PC can then control it. You can even control the LG on-screen cursor with your mouse if you want, which is kind of fun. But basically, when you're in one of these modes, you can then go to sort of an expert options thing here in the menu and adjust settings that are grayed out. So in this case, I'm able to go right in there and set the peak brightness to high. And sure enough, with it running, you immediately see the brightness jump up significantly when using the black frame insertion mode. And so I found just by forcing this, It massively improves the SDR 60 hertz black frame insertion experience, which is perfect for classic style games, good for the Switch, stuff like that. So basically, and there's a few other things you can do in there. You can also clamp the display to like sRGB and do some other cool adjustments. But basically, it opens up the door on the display. You're not even getting into service mode with this, which is another thing that requires, either a special app for an IR capable phone or a service kind of remote. But this is very easy. It saves the settings. I made the adjustment on all the inputs, and it's great. So now 60 hertz SDR black frame insertion is more usable than ever. Like, it's still obviously not going to be as bright as when it's disabled, but for me, it's more than good enough, and I definitely recommend it.
And auto HDR is also useful, right?
Yes, auto HDR is also very important, but this actually is something that I would love to see the Xbox also add an option to just force everything into an HDR container as well. You can do this on the PC and the PS5 currently, and you technically wouldn't always want this, but when you're using black frame insertion specifically, it is actually a very useful feature for bumping up the peak brightness even further. And I say that because, auto HDR works with Xbox One and older games, but auto HDR does not apply to native Series apps, right? And there's still a surprising number of games that are being released these days on all platforms that don't support HDR. So if it doesn't support HDR, you're not going to get HDR on the Xbox, right? So not that putting into an HDR container would give it HDR. It definitely would not. But this is it's a weird little feature that would be nice to have. It's already implemented in Windows, but it's basically useful for this kind of situation. I should also note, I didn't mention this before, when using HDR with black frame insertion, it's normally you want to leave the tone mapping on HDIG, I find, but specifically for this, to further push up the light output, you want to enable dynamic tone mapping. So, yeah, I mean, we can get into arguments over whether or not the picture accuracy is maintained, and it's definitely not as accurate, that's for sure. But getting the light output up while using this mode produces the closest to CRT-like experience I've ever seen on a flat panel. And it's great. I love it. I have a hard time playing games with a lot of lateral motion. I struggle to play them without it now.
Okay, so I've got one final question, John. It does still sound really involved. Could Sony or Microsoft integrate black frame insertion into the system software?
Technically speaking, you can do software-based black frame insertion. It's in stuff like MAME, I think, or RetroArch. Maybe it's RetroArch, and you can kind of achieve that if you're, like, say, outputting at 120 hertz. You sort of pulse the screen every other frame to get 60 frames per second with it. You can absolutely do that. It's not as effective as when it's driven by the panel itself, but it does actually reduce blur. That would be a neat option to see.
Because, I'm listening to what you're saying, and it does sound really involved from a technical perspective. Basically having PC apps that interface with your TV to make this stuff happen. I'm just thinking of whether there's actually a way that we could take the sort of great results you're getting here, but actually make it more mainstream and easy to access.
That would probably be a second best option. I'd be curious to see what that would look like. And, especially with the way Microsoft does things on the Xbox, it feels like something they could include as like an option. They could call it like low blur mode or something, find a way to name it there. Again, it's not as effective as the in-hardware stuff. And ultimately, that's kind of the problem, because I am talking about these LG TVs specifically. And it's only the CX and the C1 that support this properly right now. The new series, actually, in my testing, the newer model also had slightly brighter image output when using black frame insertion, but it seems that enabling this peak brightness setting on the CX kind of brings it up to similar results, I've found. But I don't know the state of other TVs. Like, if you look at Blurbusters, you'll find there's lots of monitors that do support such features like this. But in the TV space, it's hard to say, which is why, for somebody like me, this is kind of still the best option. But I would like to see an actual PC monitor that's OLED based with ultra high refresh rates supporting these types of modes. Basically do what you're seeing with these, like the top monitors rated by Blurbusters, but using an OLED panel instead. That would be absolutely supreme.
Final topic, just some interesting thoughts we've been having about guests on DF Direct Weekly. Last week we had Sam from Ars Technica, and we want to get more guests on board. So we're looking for feedback here. So if you want us to get specific personalities or engineers even from the games industry on the show, give us some ideas. We'll reach out. We'll try and get something happening there. And if you are a developer or indeed an engineer and you'd like to join us on DF Direct, that would be absolutely awesome. Alex, what do you reckon about this?
This is something that I wanted to, not for DF Direct necessarily, it's something I wanted to do for a while now, where I wanted to do streams where I would talk to developers about games that they're interested in or games they've worked on. But due to the way this year kind of worked out, it hasn't happened yet so fully. But I really, really would love to see some more developers or industry personalities who have a keen interest in tech would join us on the show, because, you know, we may look a little bit scary, but we're really friendly. We like to talk. We like to joke. And yeah, please write to us.
One of these days, I want to get Paul from Paul's Hardware on here, who people keep pointing out as like...
Can you exist in the same place
or like,
and time, though, John?
he's like my doppelganger or something. And also very much into tech stuff and has his own very large YouTube channel. So similar amount of subscribers to us, actually. So that would be fun. I don't know if it would work, though. The universe might collapse.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on. To questions from backers of the Digital Foundry Supporter Program. And if you want to get some questions fielded in the show, join us. It's awesome. Anyway, let us begin with the first question from Theo. I'd be really interested to see you guys do a deep dive on eGPUs over Thunderbolt. I think there are some interesting edge cases there. There's the obvious limitation of bandwidth compared to a desktop setup, but that's not a big problem for every game. I've also found a weird thing in my own tests, where CPU limitations are raised when using an eGPU because the integrated CPU-GPU chip has a 28-watt power limit, and when an eGPU is used, 100% of those 28 watts can go to the CPU. And he's using here a GPD Win 3. So I guess my question is, would you guys consider doing something like that? Alex?
I've always found the utility of eGPU for like someone who wasn't happy with their initial thing they bought. Like you bought this thing and maybe it had a bit of mobility to it, but then you immediately sacrifice all mobility and form factor and all these other things to attach an eGPU to it. I've never found it a great solution. So I do not think I would personally like to cover it, but the idea itself is still novel. So it would just be interesting to see what it would. I would like, maybe the reason why I would probably like to test this out ever would just be to look at those games that have bandwidth limitations and not just like completely compute bound. It would give us a greater sense of like particularly game profiles and how they scale. So maybe that's one reason why I would do it. But I personally, I'm not too interested in eGPUs over Thunderbolt or anything like that.
I have to admit, I agree with you, Alex, because, well, I have actually tested an eGPU with Intel's Ice Lake chip, okay? Because that was like the first major architectural uplift versus Skylake. And so I was really interested. I mean, in that mobile chip, I think it was 10th gen core, we got to see, Intel's new technology. How, what was the IPC improvement for games? So I actually got in a Razer core, I think it was, eGPU enclosure, stuck a 2080 Ti in there. And basically, I found it really difficult to actually ascertain what the IPC improvements were because of the power limit. Now, what Theo is saying here is 100% true, in that, yes, the CPU has a power limit. And if you aren't sharing the power and indeed the memory bandwidth of the system with the GPU, then yes, you get more out of your CPU. But fundamentally, the GPD Win 3 there, just quickly doing a bit of Googling, that's using 11th gen core, so it's going to be still a fairly low clocked quad-core part with 8 threads. And possibly, I mean, it doesn't say which GPU he's using, but I still think that you're going to be fundamentally underutilizing the GPU, both from a bandwidth perspective and also from the fact that you're far more likely to be CPU limited in demanding games. So it doesn't really appeal to me. And I think if you're going to, I mean, here's the thing, that Razer core chassis is actually not that much smaller than a mini ITX PC, where you could basically integrate everything into one unit. So why connect a laptop to it? Just doesn't really make sense for me for a use case scenario. So would you guys consider doing something like that? I've looked into it and I wasn't hugely impressed with the results. And I think it's similar to what Alex was saying, which is that we try to do topics that we're fundamentally invested in and have interest in. And if we don't have that, then it typically results in videos that we're kind of grudgingly doing, and it's reflected in the quality of the content. So yeah, let's move on to the next question. It's from Brandon Van Beacom. And he says, I have an RTX 2060 and 144 Hz monitor with an adaptive sync range of 30 to 90 Hz. When NVIDIA began supporting FreeSync, I tried it on several occasions, enabled on monitor and NVIDIA driver. Each time I tried it, I could not discern a difference versus having it disabled. I mostly choose graphical settings where FPS is well above 60 with VSync disabled. My question is, what should the benefit of adaptive sync enabled versus disabled for a situation where the game is rendering at 100 FPS on a 144 Hz monitor? Well, it is a curious question, but fundamentally, surely adaptive sync would be getting rid of the screen tearing?
Well, he has VSync disabled though. So on NVIDIA cards, you need to force VSync globally to get G-Sync to work, or VRR over HDMI, VRR over DP, whatever it is. It may not be G-Sync. But either way, you need to have VSync actually forced globally for G-Sync to apply to every game. So maybe you're not seeing it or seeing anything at all because you're actually not enabling it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's either, I don't think it's configured correctly. It's either that or he doesn't have an eye for this, because at least for me, it's extremely obvious when it's working. Because even when you're dealing with high frame rates, you still see that judder when it's not hitting the target. So between 100 and 144, there's still going to be judder there for sure when it's not functioning. But, you know, at the same time, I know some people just aren't sensitive to this stuff. So it's entirely possible that it is working and he's just not seeing it. But I suspect it's not configured correctly.
What I find curious here is, how is a 144 hertz monitor have a range from 30 to 90? What happens between 90 and 144? Does it revert back to VSync and you get horrible performance? I don't know what it means.
That's what I'm wondering as well. Is it that almost seems like it's maybe an older monitor or something with like because I don't see why you would limit the range like that.
Maybe it has a 90 hertz mode where it actually allows VR to work. I don't know what this monitor is. Write back to us.
I wish we had the model number for this to understand.
Yeah, I'm not sure what this is.
What it was doing, because it's really weird.
Okay.
Oh, wait. I'm seeing something here.
Are you finding something online?
There's an Etso monitor that has two FreeSync ranges, one that's 30 to 90, and then one that goes from 56 to 144.
Okay. So 30 to 90, though.
So wait, why? That's from 2017. I need to look into this. I'm sure there's a logical reason as to why there would be two modes in these, but I'm not aware of it.
Basically need more information for this, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
But I think if you've got like a high speed, I mean, my phone can record, could take images at 240 frames per second. If yours does the same, then, spin around on the spot in a game, in a first person shooter game, and see what is actually happening on a frame by frame basis. It should reveal all, I'd expect. Anyway, let's move on. Next question, Paul Calamata. Given that the new generation of consoles supports features such as really high refresh rates, 120 Hz output, and VRR, which had previously been exclusive to PC, are there any current or emerging technologies in the PC space that you see as providing a superior experience that simply isn't possible on today's consoles. And well, there's one massive example that springs to mind, but what do you reckon, Alex?
I was thinking of DLSS.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I was also, at least until I guess PSVR 2 comes out, I think the VR experience on PC is also something you can't get at all on console. But that's about it at the moment. There's probably some other things that I'm not thinking about because this is kind of just off the cuff. But that's about it. Right now, a good console, maybe the one thing though is that from what we've seen so far in games that target 120 hertz, most of them are not very good at it on console in a way where you would say like that's a good 120 on PC. In regards to like
frame rate or image quality, because frame rate's been pretty consistent. It's just image quality that suffers.
Yeah, that's well. I mean, you have like DMC, which I didn't think was a very good 120 experience, right?
Modern Warfare was kind of weird on Xbox. You needed VRR,
and that wasn't really a native app. DMC's the only one that sticks out to me as not being great, but most that I've tested have held. Even with a little bit of slowdown, they're still usually over 110 and mostly solid 120. But you sacrifice a lot of resolution to get there.
All right, so yeah, I guess that's the thing. One of these days, it would be really interesting to look at on the console size. It seems like them going to 120 is requiring more sacrifices than we're used to seeing regarding like what we would think their rasterization performance would be like. So I'm curious if there's something about the APU that is causing that to be the case. Maybe we could investigate that one day. But I think the 120 or hertz experience is generally just a little better on PC due to image quality, and I guess is one thing. But 240 hertz, I've tried out 240 hertz now in games. I've also tried out 300 hertz thanks to this really nice laptop. And I think at around 200, things start getting really samey. So the PC there, if you're running games at 240 or higher, you're not getting too much better than what you get on console already.
I feel like once you get over 200, though, also the sacrifices you need to make, even on a high-end PC, start to creep up to actually keep a stable frame rate, at least in more advanced games, right?
Yeah.
You can play Counter-Strike at whatever you want, but and even stuff like Doom Eternal is like really well optimized, but not everything is that fast.
No. So I don't know. I guess I would say DLSS and some of that VRR or high refresh rate experience being better.
Well, look, going back to the previous topic, it's all about machine learning, right? You can scale ray tracing. We're already seeing it on the consoles, but fundamentally, the PS5 doesn't have any kind of acceleration for machine learning functions. It's limited on Xbox, but it is there, and we're seeing these massive investments in AI and deep learning on the PC side, simply because there's a huge demand for it in the enterprise space, huge demand. And essentially NVIDIA's strategy was, well, okay, let's harmonize our development cycles and bring it into gaming as well. Initially, variable results with the first DLSS. The second DLSS shows you that there's genuine applications to this, which, this is kind of like a second iteration of a first generation technology. And it's just going to get better and better. So that's what I've got to say on that one. Next question, Neon 5. Good day, folks.
Good day.
Good day. Top of the morning. The question has come up numerous times in Discord with regards to whether a game using upscaling / reconstruction techniques should be considered or called 4K, even though it's not being rendered natively at 4K. Considering as technology evolves more and more, and especially things like DLSS 2.x, which is essentially creating new pixels on the fly to make up the presentation of a 4K image, should native resolution be the only parameter deciding whether a game is considered 4K, or should it be decided by the final presentation output of an image generated by the engine, regardless if it's upscaled or reconstructed? John?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think just calling something 4K is basically akin to a marketing term. Basically, it means an image that is designed to target a 4K capable display, right? If you want to talk native resolution, then you should always specify this is 3840 by 2160 pixels native. But we're past the point where I think native resolution is the optimal solution always. And with the rise of AI upscaling, stuff like DLSS and just the various reconstruction techniques, there's so many ways to achieve an image that looks good on a 4K display. And that's fundamentally what we're after, right? This matters because we're dealing with fixed pixel displays. Anything that's sent to the display that's lower than its native resolution is upscaled, and you get that upscale blur inherent to the display. But as long as the device is actually sending a full 4K display to it, I figure whatever they can do to massage the image, whatever technique they use, the end result, it's all about how it looks on that display. And, so I think calling something 4K is different from calling it native 2160p. And I think they should be separate. So I have no issue with calling something that's reconstructed or something using DLSS a 4K image.
For sure. I just wish that the advertising was a little bit more transparent, because like when I looked at a really great game, Returnal, I loaded up and I immediately knew that this was not like 4K. Like it just didn't look it.
But again, I agree. I know what you're saying with that. I agree as well, because that the image quality in that was not especially great. But again, it's designed to look as good as it can, but it's still targeting a 4K display. And I think 4K specifically is something that shouldn't be used to talk about resolution necessarily.
Yeah, I guess it's just like the output resolution, how it's primarily made up. I know we've talked about this before, and I saw a discussion on Twitter among graphic developers who were just miffed at the idea that we would be care about the internal resolution of a game or something like that. Because other aspects of the rendering pipeline have always been done in a sub-native fashion, whether that be Bloom, whether that be SSAO, whatever. But those aren't the primary core image quality things that actually make up the image always necessarily. So I do think it would be really great if there's a bit more transparency and advertising about how a game is made. I think Xbox has like the dynamic 4K thing. They have like a different labeling system, right?
They all use things like that.
Something like that. Like, I don't know, something that's a little bit more specific, just so you know like what you're getting into beforehand. It would help us out too.
It's a challenging one, isn't it? Because if somebody had marketed the game as being 1080p and it was actually not 1080p, then you're actually far more likely to notice the difference, right? And this is the big issue, which is that with 8.3 million pixels to address on a 4K panel, the human eye is going to have trouble sort of ascertaining, what is native resolution and what isn't, especially with temporal injection techniques and whatnot.
The thing is, though, Rich, you still said 1080p, right? You specified the resolution, right? This is akin to saying, the game is full HD versus this is 4K, right? Like, I feel like just calling it 4K or full HD, that's kind of a different term than specifying the actual resolution.
I do think basically, as the canvas size of the screen increases, you kind of reach the point where you don't actually need to address every single pixel. I think we've been on the record on that for quite some time now. And it's actually quite interesting, seeing the various discourses on upscaling techniques, including FSR, where, people seem to be quite happy with lower resolution images upscaled to 4K, even when there's a quantifiable loss to image quality. So, it's kind of all up in the air, and there is a sort of marketing aspect to it. And yeah, it just comes back to the fact that we need better ways to measure image quality, and some of the work that's being done on frequency analysis, spectral rendering is quite interesting there.
This is always something we talk about, but I still think the quality of as the number of pixels increases, the importance of actual native resolutions goes down, right? Like when you combine that with modern techniques, like the actual pixel counts have never been less important than they are right now, because you can do so much more to mitigate that. Like you look back at 2013, the reason 900p versus 1080p was a whole big deal was, one, the anti-aliasing techniques were very unrefined at the time. And two, you're dealing with fewer overall pixels. And so the upscale blur is a lot more apparent. When you combine those together, you just get more shimmering and noise. And it gets the worse you go. Or like you look at the PS3 era, especially when you had like Xbox games at 720p, and then the PS3 might be like 600 something p or something, right? With that much reduced number of pixels, the difference becomes extremely apparent, especially with the poor anti-aliasing back then. But these days, when you're dealing with like the difference between 1800p native res and 2160p native res, especially with modern anti-aliasing techniques, it's almost like non-existent. And then when you bring all the reconstruction stuff in, especially something like DLSS, where a base native resolution might be 1080p, and it could actually wind up looking cleaner than a native 2160p image, which is interesting. So the game has changed.
Okay, so this question from C. Wen. What are you guys' thoughts on so-called AI upscaling for things like full motion video content? Does it actually provide more detail, or is it just placebo? We've been experimenting with it so that we can subtitle certain Saturn era cutscenes. Well, Saturn, he's got my attention. I've got some thoughts on this, but John, you first.
AI upscaling for video definitely does work. Obviously, there's limitations compared to what we're talking about with real-time rendering, and that you're dealing with like a spatial situation. So there's only so much you can do, but it does work, and we've used it plenty of times actually to AI upscale video content. Sometimes for crazy purposes, such as my 4K 60 HD upscaled version of Chad Warden. But so when you get into Saturn, though, that's when it gets a little complicated. And I kind of ran into this when I was doing that Final Fantasy VII DF Retro, because the pixel count is very low for FMV sequences from that era. You're basically dealing with pixel art in that sense. Like, it's not, but it kind of is. And I've found that it's really difficult to upscale video from such low resolutions like that. Like, even if you have the original source file, it's like 320 by 240 or something or lower. I mean, it's probably feasible, and I haven't looked at it for a bit, but I do think it would actually be difficult to actually pull off well. So I don't know. I mean, have you guys fiddled with actual AI upscaling of very low resolution sources?
Not very low resolution, but you know, the games industry are using it, right? Wasn't it used in Skyward Sword, one of the Zelda games?
Yeah, they used it for textures. I guess, you know, you're right. There's been AI upscaling of low res backgrounds as well, and it does work. I just find that the old video, like the video codec quality, especially on Saturn, it's so poor. I don't know.
One thing that I do think, like, when you're going back to these like 240p or even sub FMV sequences from games back then, they were also usually like motion clips, like they were like 12 FPS or 10 FPS.
Usually 15 was the common on, well, PlayStation era was mostly 15.
And that's one area where I think like really smart motion interpolation could help a little bit, because I don't think, like, for some specific camera movements especially, it looks really bad. But AI upscaling from such low res, I saw it in Command & Conquer Remastered. I thought it was okay. It had its massive limitations. Like, if you were to pause a frame sometimes, it'd be some pretty weird looking stuff going on there. But I think it's okay. Just as long as if it's some sort of product coming out, it's always nice if something like that's optional, so people can see the original content.
I've got some things to add to this, not specifically from low resolution sources, but I do a lot of AI upscaling. And since we had good weather recently, I actually flew my drone to get some footage of my Starlink dish install on my house. And my drone does 1080p 60. And the video will likely be 4K. So I did some AI upscaling on it to upscale 1080p to 4K, and it works. You get extra detail. But here's the thing. There's no... The AI algorithm technique analyzes on a frame-by-frame basis. And what that means is that the way AI upscales detail changes on a frame-by-frame basis, introducing temporal discontinuity. So, you know, a little bit of fizzle here and there. So that's kind of like one of the primary issues I think that AI upscaling needs to address, temporal continuity, because I'm seeing, you can actually see now that in a still shot, it actually looks really awesome. You're getting far better clarity.
Yeah.
And extra detail does seem to be resolved. But when you're looking at it in motion, you see what you might call AI upscaling artifacts. And it is that, I believe, that discontinuity in how the detail is being upscaled from frame to frame. So there needs to be some kind of temporal component to smooth that out, in my opinion. And I'm not sure we're there at the moment, but certainly an interesting question. And I actually really love to see these algorithms work because, as we saw with our Bloodborne footage, the way the models actually process lower resolution footage and upscale it produces some fascinating results. It's good stuff, there's bad stuff. It's early days, but clearly there's something there. Okay, so next question from Hedonism Bot.
Okay.
Almost as good as 343 Salt Baron.
Yeah, I like that.
That one's great.
From the Halo 3 technical Halo 5. Halo Infinite technical preview.
Almost, yeah.
But this question, my God, it's colossal, but let's get through it. There are several methods and solutions in the PC gaming space for rendering, for reducing render latency in games, from controlling the max number of pre-rendered frames in DX11 titles to latency options in NVIDIA and AMD control panels, to NVIDIA's new Reflex API that devs can integrate directly into their games to remove the queuing of frames entirely. Pause for breath. On top of that, you can use various solutions to cap the frame rate of games and even use bespoke tools like Special K to cap frame rate and inject some of the Reflex API work to keep latency down. Right, okay. The scene has been set. My question is, would Digital Foundry, particularly Alex, be interested in doing a deep dive into these options, how the render queue actually works and the impact all of these tend to have on frame times, as some can make games wildly unstable? I've been impressed by the results of some of them and the way they are combined with a frame cap to keep within a G-Sync range of a screen, but would also be interested to see comparisons to latency in titles that are also optimized on console. And relax.
Whoa.
Wow.
It's a long one.
It is.
Okay, so I've talked about queuing before when I did a video on VSync. But even without VSync on, the game can still be queuing frames for a variety of reasons, just depending on how it does its rendering workload, how it's multi-threaded. Some games actually induce like queuing for their multi-threading, so they purposely add an input latency to make sure that the threads are more spread across all, the CPU cores that are available. So there are some things that actually cannot be turned off. Even when you are touching things in DX11 titles, like reducing the number of pre-rendered frames to 0, which I'm pretty sure going back in time, they always admitted was a placebo when you asked NVIDIA engineers, that there was no 0 option. It was just there for some reason. Would I be interested in talking about video about how the rendering queue actually works? It will be different from game to game, so it's a little bit hard to talk about. And the one thing is that the render queue, reducing it heavily, and at times when you have great CPU latency spikes or GPU latency spikes in a single frame, could cause horrific frame times, which we at Digital Foundry are very much so against, even in the VRR context. So I am not always actually such a big fan of reducing the rendering queue down to levels so that you get razor sharp mouse input latency on every title. Because I think after about 120 frames per second with double buffered VSync feels almost like I can't even feel it anymore. Triple buffering, yeah, I can still feel that. But like, I honestly don't, I think this is an interesting topic. I just don't know. There's already a channel out there. Battle Nonsense does these things, talks about them a lot, and has done videos over the years on all of these topics. I think the more interesting one of what you're saying out here, not in the PC space since that's already covered so well, but would be to maybe cover latency in the console space in comparison to PC as a control. Like where you would say this PC as a control, and NVIDIA has a little diode thing that you can plug into controllers and also into televisions to get really great input latency feedback. I think that's a topic we could touch in a video, specifically in games when they start coming out and they're targeting 120 on PC and console. And we could say like, okay, so what's actually the difference here? Maybe this is another difference that PC has versus console that we don't know about yet because we haven't talked about it. So I would like to do that in the future. I don't have this little input latency device that NVIDIA has. I think we have one in the studio. I think Will maybe has it. Will, you've got one? Will?
I've got it. Well, it's in the post. Tom
it's in the post. Tom had it. Okay, well, that's a really good device. Oh, that's it. Yeah. So that's a device to use and utilize and try out. But that's one thing I would do in the future. Probably console versus PC input latency in a controlled scenario with VSync on, not VSync off. So yeah, that's about it.
Fair enough. Okay, final question from 343 Salt Baron. No, actually, it's Edwin Crump.
Hey, Crump. Crump. That's an amazing name.
I'm telling you, 343 Salt Baron is my spirit animal, my spirit bot. Anyway, DF has worked in different places for a long time, with John in Germany going back years, and in France, actually. But do you, Rich, miss being in the office with other team members in any way? In any way. Such as having a small studio set up to do pieces to camera on, or it's being easier to review works in progress? This does seem to be like a specific question for me, because, yeah, we did used to have a Digital Foundry office. We had, a few staff in there, and there were advantages, right? Because you had people to talk to. You could split tasks up. You could have somebody helping you out setting up the camera or the lighting or whatnot. And, that's all, it's all really good stuff. You could do face-to-face videos, discussion videos, rather than these virtual ones. Do I miss it, though? Not really. Principally, I prefer working at home. I prefer working to my own schedule, whereas when you're in an office, you kind of should stick to prescribed hours. I mean, you might get locked in or out of the office otherwise. And also the sort of collaboration angles, I kind of prefer doing it the way we do these directs. It's far less intrusive. We get more people on, and I think the results are generally better. I do miss having a dedicated studio space, but I might be addressing that at my home. And just generally, in terms of the situation's almost been rendered moot in light of the pandemic, where we could go back to the office now, but I really wouldn't want to do it. And so just generally, I'm not missing it really. I suppose the one thing in terms of doing a work-life balance, actually having prescribed hours does make a significant difference, in that you can turn off. If your home does not contain your work equipment, then it's much easier to maintain a work-life balance, and that is a challenge for us. But fundamentally, I prefer working from home. I guess at a pure logistical level, the concept of the time taken going to and from an office is basically dead space, dead time. Can't do anything in it. I don't like it at all. So yeah, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, and the pandemic is kind of like the final thing that sort of makes it better to be working from home at this time.
At least the way I work, I don't think working in an office anymore actually makes sense. Like, I don't think I could produce the way I do from an office, because sometimes the hours get weird, or just like sometimes you're on, sometimes you're not. And there's a lot of thought that goes into that, but it's more just like equipment wise, like I couldn't do the DF retro stuff, I think, from an office, because there's no way I could have the setup that I used to make that possible, like in an office space. It would just take up, I wouldn't want to leave it there, and it would take up a ridiculous amount of room. And, just all the optimizations for the setup and the way that everything's done, it's just not really feasible or comfortable to do in an office. And I think I would be slower overall at getting stuff done that way.
I think I would be too. Yeah, my goodness. I mean, I've always worked here remote for Digital Foundry, and in the most, different circumstances. Like right now, my setup is getting more and more optimized all the times. There was, a period of time where it was very unoptimized due to the work at home setup that I could realistically have. But nowadays, if I had to change my setup drastically and go into an office every day, my work would suffer. And I wouldn't really want that.
I think the counterpoint to that is that when we take a trip to John's place, we typically center there to meet up. We have a great time and do some great stuff.
Yeah.
It's very different
fun.
from our standard stuff.
Yeah. It's
like
fun
that
once in
stuff,
a while, but not, it's not necessary all the time.
I'm really
again, the pandemic's put pay to that as well.
I'm really hoping in the future, though, that we'll get another Gamescom meetup in 2022, maybe if the stars align. Because when we did Gamescom meeting up for the Turing reveal, NVIDIA Turing, that was great. We had so much fun together.
It was just awesome to see your face during the Turing reveal. You just couldn't believe your eyes.
Oh yeah,
that was it the entire time.
But that was your first real announce event, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was totally. It was the first time I saw any sort of like GPU announcement event in person. I'd always followed on live on stream, which is very different.
But it must have been a revelatory moment when they actually announced hardware accelerated ray tracing. I think I saw your jaw literally drop.
So this is really funny because there was a I forget what it was. Oh, it was in GPU Gems 2. Which everyone should download it. It's amazing. It's free. It's like 550 pages long. It's awesome. I don't have a hardcover on the way. I kind of regret it now that I didn't order a hardcover of it. But they mentioned in the opening chapter of GPU Gems 2 of Ray Tracing Gems 2 that after the fact, they're surprised people didn't connect the dots that hardware ray tracing was coming. Like no one even talked about it. Like we didn't. Like I made a video on what DXR was before Turing GPUs came out, and I said like, how long are we going to actually have to be waiting for this? And I did like a trajectory of how big like Volta GPUs were in comparison to what we currently had on the market. Then I was like, we're going to be getting this at real time at 1080p 60 in like 2 GPU generations. Well, that was wrong. So. I find it very funny after the fact that I was actually surprised back then. We should have been a little bit smarter, maybe.
Well, I mean, that's quite interesting because I did actually float ray tracing as a potential for the next generation consoles way back when, simply because of the fact that Microsoft were championing DXR. And, why would they do that? Surely it's not just for enterprise applications. And then obviously NVIDIA did that thing with, what was it, like 3 Volta cards?
Yeah, the DGX one.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, the DGX stuff.
It was it was Metro Exodus, I think was one of the demos there. Several demos. There was a Remedy one as well. In fact, basically everything that we eventually saw coming to RTX cards, we actually saw initially running on these 3
DGX.
Volta setups. So yeah, that was awesome. Quite fascinating, wasn't it? It's just it's just amazing to see technology advance quicker than we think it's going to be. And I think just generally, I think the consoles have outperformed our expectations
on every level,
on pretty much every level. And it's basically set an excellent baseline for gaming technology across the entire generation. And I actually think that it's also validated everything that PC is great with. The whole sort of concept of taking new technology and running with it and seeing that validated over time, it's just been quite gratifying from my perspective. I mean, to go from those initial demos to Control or Cyberpunk 2077.
Big
RTX
differences there, yeah.
Just astonishing. Anyway, I think that answers that question. So that's it. That's our show for the week. So many thanks to you guys for joining me for this one. And of course, inevitably, we should be back next week. But we're also considering doing some possibly direct specials.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Concentrating on specific topics. And maybe, the discussion that we had earlier about this concertina effect in GPU pricing and the concept that the 1080p GPU is almost like an endangered species these days. That's kind of like one big topic that we could talk about. Another one which came up was the biggest generational leap and the weakest generational leap. I mean, these are all great topics. So if you've got any kind of suggestions along those lines, do let us know, because we want to get these specials out, especially over the holiday period this Christmas. So that's all from us for now. As usual, if you like the content, please like. I guess if you didn't like it, dislike. Ring the bell for instant notifications.
Yes, he said instant.
I did say instant. Hashtag instant notifications whenever we drop new DF content. And if you're not subscribed, subscribe. DF support program, behind the scenes material, awesome DF retro stuff, early access to the direct. It's all awesome stuff, so join us there. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.
Top of the morning.